Good midday, Anine, and hello. Before I welcome you to journalism at the Creative School at Toronto Metropolitan University, I want to acknowledge that we're filming today so that there's a record of this conversation. That's very important and joyful one that we're hoping to have, but also so that you're aware that if you're asking questions and so on, there's a recording that's available. As some of you know, today, it marks an auspicious time of year in the journalism world and in the school world overall. We're in the midst of application season, where young people everywhere are deciding what feels like the biggest decision of their life. What am I going to do next? It's meaningful that today we're joined by two journalists who made that same decision decades ago to come here, choosing journalism and this university at the time, which wasn't even yet a university, but in a way that has left an indelible mark on their lives and through their work on all of ours. It is really important to see that they probably saw that this is a possibility for engaging in a public good that we don't take lightly, and that students who are thinking about journalism, as I discussed with my class today, are thinking about what am I going to do with this, not simply what brings me to it out of an interest. It's a doing profession. And that's what we're here to celebrate, a lifetime of stories and storytelling, showcasing why stories matter both at home and in the field, and to talk about how journalism shapes the world that we see. Our panel understands the importance of questioning power and pursuing truth wherever the story might be. It's what brought them here then, I would argue, and still what drives them and all of us who teach, study, and work towards the practice of journalism today. We're gathered on the treaty lands and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional areas of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe peoples, lands now home to many First Nations, Inuit, Métis, immigrant, and settler communities. With the Atkinson Foundation, which is a key foundation by the people who founded the Toronto Star, I shared some of the ideas that they have in a previous land acknowledgement that I think is actually valuable here today. They focused on the economic value of it, but they recognized that colonization on these lands was, and continues to be, a settler project upheld by institutions and the restriction of free expressions of power, shaping how Indigenous peoples and other peoples around the world are seen, and sometimes also how they're forgotten. Reflecting on this compels us to consider what justice looks like when stories are hidden or prioritized unequally. But here we acknowledge the One Dish Wampum as a treaty emphasizing peace, respect, friendship, and the principles that guide us and how we learn from the past to build a better way forward into the future. Here we also emphasize that that spirit is the spirit that we use to come together to share our stories and to welcome two members of our school and professional family who, though long ago graduated, still hold this place close to their hearts, close enough that they wanted to be here, not just simply that they were invited because it could have been an interesting thing. This is a place that matters to them and it matters to us. Here and in their work, they learn the importance of showing up and shedding light through journalism around the world. My name is Ravindra Mohibir. I'm the chair of the school, and on behalf of my colleagues and my students, many of whom are assembled, it is an honor to welcome you into today's conversation between two distinguished members of our community. Brian Stewart in conversation with Paul Workman about Brian's recent memoir, On the Ground, My Life as a Foreign Correspondent. To continue, I'd like to introduce our panel a little bit more directly. Paul Workman spent 35 years as a foreign correspondent with CBC and CTV, ending his career as CTV's international correspondent in London. In 2024, he also received the Gordon Sinclair Lifetime Achievement Award for Broadcast Journalism. An alumnus of what was then Ryerson in the early 1970s, like many students in this school, classes were only a part of what he did. He was also a co-editor of the Eye Opener, and he worked part-time at the Toronto Sun, which today is an institution, but back then was new. His career took him from the Ottawa Citizen to the world's capitals, covering historic events including the fall of the Berlin Wall and wars in the Middle East, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. He's helped us see things that we might not have been on the ground to see ourselves. In a similar way, Brian Stewart, whose book is available at the back for you to consider, Brian Stewart showcases how he's done and followed a fairly similar pattern in different kinds of ways, starting a little bit earlier and going in other directions. And his new book is the centerpiece of today's talk. And Brian Stewart is one of Canada's most prominent television journalists, Acclaimed for his foreign coverage for CBC's The National and The Journal, and he's also an alumnus of what was then the Ryerson School of Journalism. He began his career in newspaper reporting before becoming a foreign correspondent for the CBC in London and NBC in Frankfurt. He worked in 10 war zones, hosted CBC's Worldview, and interviewed historic figures, including, and probably prominently, part of the way that we get to know Nelson Mandela, Margaret Thatcher, Salman Rushdie, Henry Kissinger, and others. After retiring, he was appointed a senior fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs. In the conversation that I had this morning, one of the things we said was that journalism is not simply journalism. It's journalism of a lot of different forms. And in that way, it is a recognition that journalism becomes an important cornerstone or foundation of public conversations, thus the global affairs. University of Toronto recognizes this in his appointment, but he's also the recipient of the Order of Ontario, the Queen's Jubilee Medal, and the Order of Canada. We all know that journalism provides a unique window to the world that many of us will rely on vicariously. On behalf of the students and everyone here, I look forward to hearing about what drew them to this work in their youth and continues to inspire them as they've done a lifetime of great work in a conversation in a very unique way, in a very unique setting, in a home that I hope that they both see as still theirs. It is a true honor to welcome our panel back to TMU, for sure, to a new building. And a building that you might notice is a very lived-in space, because you don't come here, and if you're talking to a person who is applying now for school, you don't come here to learn about the field, you come here to do the work. And this is a space that amplifies that greatly. But it's also a space that is in a new building with an evolving program, but one that's still rooted in a very key principle: the power of a good story and the importance of helping develop extraordinary storytellers helps us all learn about the world in a very different way. So with that, I would like to welcome our guests today, Paul Workman, in conversation with Brian Stewart. Thank you.
Shall I kick it off?
Yes, absolutely.
Just to say welcome to everybody. I see some faces of people I worked with years ago, and it's so good to have you here. Thank you for coming. And so many young journalism students. Takes me back decades when I was here. Brian as well. He was here a few years earlier than I was.
I'll just mention, it's very moving for me to be back here, place from which I graduated 61 years ago, and came here to become a foreign correspondent 64 years ago. So it's always moving every time I'm around Ryerson. And I'll just say very quickly, because in case it doesn't come up later, dozens of times when I was in the field, I had occasion to flash back in my thoughts to lessons I learned here at Ryerson in class. And it stayed with me, and it proved incredibly invaluable throughout my entire career, and that's something I look back on with great fondness even now.
Well, for me, it's a privilege to sit down with you, Brian. I'll start with a few compliments, if I may. I mean, you really did remarkable work over the decades, deep and thoughtful journalism that set a standard for the rest of us at the CBC and other places to try to match and to try to meet. You also had a very interesting writing and delivery style that I found quite particular, and I tried to mimic. I tried to imitate a few times and failed miserably at it because it was your style, and it came across on television in such a strong, strong way. Anyway, it's so good to be here with you. I still call this place Ryerson, and I'm sure you do too, but we'll get over it.
We will, yeah.
I'd like to begin with the whole idea of writing a memoir. It's a daunting proposition. It certainly is, to take your life and put it together in a book of 200, 300 pages. Did you have a purpose, an idea of what you wanted to write, what you wanted to put down when you started?
Actually, not at all. In fact, I didn't want to write a memoir. I made a determination as I was retiring from work that I would never write a memoir. I didn't want to go back over some things, and I didn't think I had it in me. I had confessed this now. I was kind of dreaming of writing a spy novel, an espionage novel, which maybe, journalists are quite good at. Keep that in mind. Simon and Schuster, the publishers, came to me and said that they had heard from several people that I had a life story that And I had seen, not only seen things abroad, but I had gone through some things in my personal life that are somewhat, commonplace in journalism today. And they wanted to get to the bottom of what is it that causes somebody to take on such a profession? And what do they do? What do foreign correspondents actually do? They see them on camera or they read their stuff, but what is the life like and what brings people to it and how do they maintain themselves in it? And when I got into that, I started to think, I've always had a good long-term memory. I've always been fascinated by decades. I was born in the middle of the Second World War. I grew up a kid of the post-war, the Cold War. I was always interested as a youth, seeing history develop. And I thought, well, maybe I will be able to, by going through the decades and how they influence me and how they influence my work and how I experience them, that would be the linkage in the book. And once I started it, the framework became quite easy, actually, to write down. It was grind to write. There were a couple of times I wanted to give it all up. It was just murderous work sometimes. But I stuck it out, and the framework was clear enough. And I should say, thanks to Simon and Schuster, I had a brilliant editor, a legendary editor, Rosemary Shipton, who I can't praise enough. She's even older than I am. she even worked on Lester Pearson's biography, but she's just fabulous. And she gave me such great guidance at times when I would get lost in the weeds, which does happen a lot.
As always happens, you've answered my second question already, Brian. But I want to talk a little bit more about the mechanics and very briefly about how you organized the book. You have a long-term memory, of course, that helps you a terrific amount. But I know as a teenager you kept diaries of wanting to be a wannabe journalist. Did you keep a journal yourself as you were going through the years? And how much did that help you in putting your book together in the end?
They did help somewhat, though not as much as I had wished, because I have what I call my Ryerson diaries, the ones I kept in the early 60s, a full page every single day, which was just fascinating to go over. But I kept spotty ones when I was in the field, but very spotty. And they're often, as people who write diaries will recognize, you often write them when your life is going through crap. So, in the good years, you're not writing the diaries because you're too busy. So often the diaries covered areas I didn't really want to go back into all that much. The good times were due to my memory. But, working in television, I had access to at least the storylines of it was hard to get into the archives and see video, but I could find out where I was in a given day and going back over thousands of stories. And once I pinpointed, well, I was in Addis Ababa that day, or I was in Warsaw that day, I was interviewing so-and-so. I'd have that much information. It would all come back to me pretty clearly. But one of the things I've been saying at groups, when I talk to them, I urge everybody to write a memoir. Keep notes, because we never know. Write a memoir, even if it's 10 pages for your family. People are going to be interested. One day history may even be interested. I love reading the diaries of people who lived in the 1800s. I just love it. And I think all of us have lives that are interesting. And if you're young and lucky and young today to be living in this incredible time of history, keep your notes. 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now, they're going to be fascinating for you and for your family and maybe even for history.
I kept boxes and boxes of notes from all of the reporting I did over the years. And when I went back to look at them, I realized I couldn't read my own writing. And that was the mess. So they were absolutely useless to me. But just another little point about writing a memoir. This may be the most difficult part for you. It allows you to be judgmental about people, about situations, to call out wrongs. It allows you to be critical. Was that a change for you, and did you find it liberating or difficult to work around?
No, I didn't actually think about that very much. I realized, well, part of it is, I am 83. I mean, the runway ahead isn't all that long. So it was a time to be kind of honest. I'm not back 20, 30, 40 years younger, with still a career to play around with, or ambitions and the rest of it. So it's a nice time to sit back and just be honest about people. And reflecting on people, I saw a lot of them had virtues much higher than I recognized at the time. Many of them helped me much more than I ever thought they had really helped. Even the ones that I knew had helped me had actually helped me even more. So those were things I wanted to square up with. I had a few grudges, we all do. I didn't want to get into them, actually. I don't like hurting people's feelings, so I kept away from a couple of grudges. But basically, it's just the honest recounting of how I saw people and how I worked with them.
Were you happy with the book?
Yes, I have to say I was. By the way, I love the cover. I think Simon and Schuster did a great job of the cover. In the end, the only thing I regret, I wish I had taken maybe one more page. I think is one page short at the conclusion when I wanted to sum up some emotions. And I got off the canoe a little bit too early, I thought. Apart from that, I'll stand with it. And I'm kind of happy with it. And
great. You start the book writing about the famine in Ethiopia. I wonder if you'd read just a short excerpt for us. Have you got your glasses, Brian?
Yeah. I'm not a good reader.
Because it really is quite compelling. I've marked it. It's not very much, but I think you'll be riveted.
From here to
Yeah.
Almost immediately, I noticed a short, lean man in the customary shawl who was trying to comfort a girl about 3 years old who looked barely conscious. She seemed to be the most serious case there, and I kept glancing their way as I continued my interviews. Suddenly, the child slumped into a heap on the pavement. I called to a nearby nurse, and she rushed forward, picked up the girl, and raced her inside to the examination room. The father ran after them, and we followed, camera rolling. As we entered, the girl lay on a table. I was struck by her face as her glazed eyes appeared locked on something far in the distance, and her rasping breath slowed. In my emotional state, I saw her face as a tragic symbol of Ethiopia's countless children denied hope, robbed of life, beseeching the distant world for justice. A tired-eyed Irish sister said softly, "The child will die very soon. She has pneumonia and is very malnourished. She will die here, maybe within 15 minutes. There isn't anything we can do at this point."
Thank you. And so began an event in your career that really changed your life. You would never be the same after Ethiopia. Is that fair? And would you tell us about that?
Yeah, Ethiopia, I began that chapter because I couldn't think of another place more suited. It was the seminal event of my career and of my life. In the winter of 1984, my producer, Tony Berman, one of the great figures I met in my career, was sitting, by the way, at the back of the room, very modestly as always. We began hearing, we were based in London at the time, we began hearing rumors from aid groups and from various diplomats coming back that something horrible was happening in the north of northern Ethiopia, which was the Marxist regime, and they had basically cut off the north from outside media. They didn't want any television cameras there. The world was basically barred, and we kept hearing stories of great hunger and hunger bordering on famine, and this could probably become a famine, and the world wasn't responding. Nobody was paying any attention anywhere in the world. The United Nations wasn't even discussing it. So Tony and I kept trying to get into northern Ethiopia. He went to the embassy over and over and over again, and finally, to my utter amazement, persuaded them that the CBC, because we were Canadian and we were a country that almost everybody respected in those days, would be let in. They also let a crew from the BBC in at the very same time. We got into northern Ethiopia, and that's when everything changed, certainly in my life. I had prepared enormously for such a story. I had read everything I could about Ethiopia and northern Ethiopia. I read all the aid group findings and papers on the subject. I read about famine and medical descriptions of what happens when a famine hits. A famine is not just a hunger. A famine is a separate thing altogether. It happens very rarely, and it always happens when there's not only a failure of crops and the climate, but there is a failure of government, and there is a conflict that just rages in the area. And that's what was happening there. I got in thinking I was ready for that, and I was completely, I won't say the word blown away, because all I could see was blowing dust and sand in the horizon when we got in there at times. I saw basically a world after the apocalypse. It looked to me like a biblical apocalypse was happening. There were dead along the roads. There were famine was along every road and at the gates of every town. There were children dying. There were refugee camps where up to 100 would die a day. Only 20 were dying a week earlier. It was just a momentum towards disaster. Aid people were telling us millions are going to die here, millions, unless the world responds and very quickly. That became our objective. How do you alert the world to a story of this magnitude? We're getting footage, the like of which CBC has never put on air. Networks have never put on air. Just people dying in the streets and just dying before their camera, and mothers holding children up who are already dead. They thought we could save them, and who are we, just journalists? So we did a story, the hard one, which was so we feared the government would intervene and take it away from us, so we wouldn't be able to alert the world. And Tony Berman, my producer, who's back there, the last seat in the house, taped it to his back and smuggled it out of Ethiopia so we could get it to Nairobi and feed it back to Canada, risking God knows what kind of jail term had he been roused at the customs, and all of us would have been thrown out or jailed. Anyways, that story goes out, and it has a historian has called it a tsunami effect on Canada. Canada responded in ways that no other country did for months on end. It just changed this country. It changed us. And that's, in about 5 days into the story, I came across this dying girl who collapsed on the pavement. And we went in, and we all thought, you know, one more death, one more burial. We're filming a lot of burials. We go away to film some, come back to film her burial that afternoon, because they're burying people in the same day because of the risk of diseases, of course. We come back, and we found a little group of people around the smiling and laughing, and nobody laughed in Ethiopia in those days. And we ran forward, and there was the nurse holding the girl in her arms. And I said, "Nurse, we seem to have seen a bit of a miracle today, have we?" She said, "Yes, we stuck a needle in her, and she's back alive." And she did survive. And I did a news report on if she can survive, maybe Ethiopia can. She became a kind of symbol. That's where we thought this story ended, but 9 months later, was it? Live Aid is shown, the giant Live Aid. Geldof is shown this tape that his CBC editor, Colin Dean, put together of the best of not the best, take that a word away, the worst of the CBC footage from the field. And David Bowie, great singer, of course, said he wouldn't go on that day unless they showed that tape. Geldof argued with him, didn't particularly want it, in the end gave way. And if you ever see the Live Aid performance done, Bowie comes out and said, to show the world what is really at stake here, we want to show you this video, and they show it, and it ends with her face. And that's the point when Live Aid got the great overwhelming response from 1.1 billion people. Phones were melting, phone lines were melting as people called in, according to Geldof. Anyways, years later, Berman and I, feeling guilty that, you know, how this girl who meant so much to so many people is back there somewhere lost in northern Ethiopia in the war that was going on, the famines that were always threatening to reappear. So we went back and we found her, and we didn't. So I found her and I set her up, and I've supported her family ever since. But her documentaries on her were symbols of life after death, which is the title of one, where we tried to show that, you know, we had a message we wanted to get out, that news should not just go into places and show disaster areas. An old Irish priest came up to me in the middle of that famine and said, you know, you network news people, you journalists are very good rushing in here and doing things and showing horrible things happening to people and people suffering and dying. And then you fly away to the next place and you leave us here, of course. And you don't stick around and see neighbors coming together to help neighbors, schools being rebuilt, societies coming together. So I went back to the CBC, the Journal, led by the great Journal team itself, Mark Starowitz sitting right in the front here. And I said to the Journal and to the news, CBC has to do more follow-up to catastrophes. We go in and we follow up on wars and catastrophes. And this became a bit of a signature for CBC. You'll remember, for many years, we did go back and we did stay in these places. So I went back to Ethiopia many times after that, doing updates on how things were doing. And that deeply affected, her face affected, Ethiopia affected, not only my career, but the way CBC did a lot of things in those years.
That's the longest on-camera stand-up, Brian, I've ever heard you give.
I know.
My God,
I know.
without a note.
I get seized by the story, and I don't know where to get out.
But I want to pick up on the point, because did it make you somewhat confused? You were surrounded by this incredible misery. You're a professional journalist. We have red lines and standards that we don't cross. But it made you an advocate. It made you very much involved with a young girl that you met and then looked after for many, many years.
Well, no, I looked after her family and a charity that they were working with. I went back to Ethiopia to do documentaries on the country and its survival. And you raised the question, though, should journalists ever be advocates? Well, usually not, but there are always exceptions, are there not? I remind myself, what if I was a journalist down in Louisiana or Mississippi in 1962? Would I be neutral between the anti-segregation forces and the Ku Klux Klan? Would I give both equal time? If I was a journalist in Berlin in 1938, 39, would I be neutral in my telling of stories of the Kristallnacht?
What do you think? What do you think?
I don't think I would be, and I don't think it'd be justifiable. And I think in some times when journalism has gone overboard to try and be neutral, it is in effect almost committed a crime of staying silent. And sometimes in history, that's the worst crime of all. And journalists can't stay silent. And when you come out, you can't say, I have two interesting opinions here. One of them is a racial opinion by the Ku Klux Klan, and another is an opinion by this strange person, Martin Luther King, that claims the races are equal. But we're going to give them equal time, don't worry. And, you know, basically, there is an element of truth that comes out. Famine, how are you neutral in a famine? How do you say, well, it's kind of up to the world whether we come in here or not. I mean, it's all your decision. It is your decision, of course, and it is. But, you know, life will go on if nothing happens. We're just showing you these images of death, destruction, and children dying and their whole future's been wiped out. But we're not going to take a stand on it, good heavens. We're not going to say, unless the world responds very quickly, this isn't just the height of a famine, but the beginning of an even greater one, which is what I said on air that second night, I think it was. That was my stand-up, that unless the world respond very quickly, this is not the height of a famine, but only the beginning of an even greater one. That's hardly a neutral stand-up.
You had this incredible, extraordinary story in Ethiopia. You beat the world. You were about the only crew on the ground. I think the BBC. Came in a little bit later.
Earlier.
And afterwards, you felt like crap. You felt terrible as a human being. There was no exhilaration. There was only guilt, I've heard you say. Tell us.
Yeah, I've said before, but just recently I've started saying this, that I never felt smaller than at the time I was doing the biggest story of my life. Because I think all of us in that CBC crew and the journalists that came after us, you feel when you're there in the midst of this overwhelming ocean of human misery week after week after week. You're just standing there. You're just a reporter. I don't even know first aid. I mean, people are showing their children to us. Could you help us out? And there are no medical people around at that particular time. We can't do anything to help. And even when you tell yourself, well, your story did a lot to help, you tell yourself that a lot. But as the years go by, you always will start having flashbacks, flashbacks of moments when you could have stopped the van and picked up this woman and her children, put them in the van and driven her to the feeding center. But there are 50 other families, 100 other families, maybe 1,000 other families at the same time. You could have pulled $10 out of your pocket and handed to this poor man and his starving family. But are you playing God or what? What are you doing? Nothing you ever do, for some people this is the case, nothing you ever do really is adequate to how you see yourself as a person. You don't live up to your own sense of virtue. And that carries with it, I don't know if you want to get into that now, but a real scourge.
Did you rationalize when you were there about what you couldn't do, your helplessness? Did that affect the way you wrote your stories?
I don't know. I can't really recall that. I remember writing stories with this great dread. I had to sit down, and by the way, I should put some background is we rarely had more than 2 or 3 hours sleep a night. We were utterly exhausted. So I would write down, the first story I wrote was the only one I can ever remember having written without a single word change. Usually I do over and over and over rewrites. And it just went out and it was the perfect story. I've never found a single word to change in it. And it just came over me to write the right story. But we were driven by dread. I know Tony Berman was driven by the dread. How do we alert the world? Because we're being told by Red Cross people, if the world doesn't come in, we're going to lose 4 million people. That went up to 5 million people. Within about 9 months, it was up to 7 million people at risk, just in Ethiopia alone. And after Ethiopia, we were there for weeks on end. We went to Sudan next door because it had a famine. So we were basically going around Africa covering famines in Sudan, Mozambique, and then we actually raced off to South Africa after that, when I was basically in a situation of collapse. So I didn't feel the guilt so much then. I felt it when I was back in London. That's when a lot of journalists start to feel, you get comfortable again, you have your shower, you got clean clothes on, you're going out to dinner with friends, life is good. Wait a minute, it's not so good after all. It's not as good as I anticipated because maybe I should have done more. And this can become a real, there are 2 problems. I don't know whether you want to get into it now, but PTSD, as we all know, is a great scourge of journalism, as it is of aid workers and soldiers and anybody who works in these kind of areas. But there's another problem called moral injury.
This is where I wanted to go next, okay. Brian. We all know the incredible international impact that your reporting on the famine had. Just amazing that it shook the world in such an extraordinary way. But it also had such a terrible personal toll on you. Physically, mentally, you had a nervous breakdown. Years later, yes, but it was all from those reporting days in Ethiopia. Was there a trigger all those years later? And talk to me a little bit about moral injury versus PTSD.
Yeah, well, about 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, a very courageous Toronto psychiatrist, Anthony Feinstein, who works at Sunnybrook, is named to remember. He started really working on the kind of plagues that affected mental and emotional plagues that affected journalists. Not just foreign correspondents, of course, but journalists who also cover grotesque catastrophes at home and problems. And he was the first to really start studying journalism for PTSD. And he had a lot of opposition and came not only from management that didn't want poking around in that, but a lot of journalists didn't want to be poked around in that area and stood against him, but he persisted. And now he's kind of a legend in the business. PTSD, we're all pretty well familiar with most of their symptoms, flashbacks to frightening areas. PTSD is largely brought about by dangerous situations, by a fear factor. And it can lead to flashbacks, all the sort of meltdown aspects of journalists you've often seen portrayed: alcoholism, broken marriages, lives on the rocks. It's affected a fair number of journalists, though by not means always. But he found out that something like 60% of journalists didn't suffer from PTSD, which surprised him. Why not? But they also had another symptom that was very similar to PTSD. And that has been called in the last 10 or 12 years moral injury. It's described by Anthony Feinstein as a wound to the soul. And people weren't taking this into account, that when you do these stories sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you're affected by this feeling that you let the side down, you let humanity down, you let yourself down, you let your parents down. And this causes this kind of wound to the soul that's very hard to treat, where you just feel, I wasn't worthy of that, wasn't worthy of that. And I suffered from that, and that led to, he thinks, to my nervous breakdown, which I was treated for and got over, and it's passed in my life now. But it's a worry that people in those situations will face.
But this happened to you many years later.
Many years, 20 years later, I forget, it was 1990s. My gosh, yes. Well, no, it could 15 years or so later. It can happen even 20 years later, 30 years later. These flashbacks can come on you. And you have to sort of learn to live with the fact that you're not a savior. You're not get out of your savior complex. You're not a Superman. You can't do everything.
Is there some advice? Sorry, please go ahead, Brian.
No, but I do think journalists now and management now, thank God, with some exceptions, are so much more set for this kind of stuff now. I mean, you have war courses now for journalists for CBC going abroad to cover a war. You have real serious first aid. I didn't even have first aid. I mean, my cameraman could have had a leg blown off. I wouldn't know what to do. I'd be sitting next to him saying, I'm not sure what I should do here. I mean, it was that kind of ridiculous situation. But, all of that is caught up to the business now. But people who go into that line of work should be very aware that, or working in volunteer work, humanitarian work, in some of these situations, they don't come without a high price sometimes being hit. Could I say something on the positive side about
Please,
if I could, yeah. Part of my feeling small at the time was due to the enormous bigness of Canada. The CBC story was revolutionary in a way, as was the BBC, by the way, though in a very different manner. When CBC hit November the 1st, 1984, this country had a shock wave go through it. Canada's response was beyond praise. Never before in Canadian history, peacetime history, or since, has a country ever responded to a disaster or a catastrophe anything like it. The government of the day of Brian Mulroney got solidly behind it. He decided that he sent his ambassador to the UN, Stephen Lewis, an NDPer, of course, down there to raise hell, to get the world behind saving Ethiopia and Africa. Canada took the lead in the world. The government formed a partnership with the people of Canada. The giving in this was way ahead of other countries for months on end before the British musicians in Geldof, my old friend, got involved in this and did their marvelous work. And Canada, for 2 years, was on the case of famine and need in Africa. It didn't suffer from famine fatigue. It went on and sort of led the field month after month. And I have to say that one of the reasons it was a seminal event for me is because it was for the CBC and for this country, I believe, where the CBC and the country work so well together. Journalism and the country work so well together.
I think you described Canada in those days as known as a Samaritan nation, and you do have high praise for Brian Mulroney and the government and the country at that time, but I don't think you would say the same today about where Canada is. I know that's one of your issues, one of your great thoughts, Brian.
Indeed, it's back in the 70s and 80s, there was often a word went around for Canada and the world called the Samaritan state, the state that always had to rush in and try and help people or wanted to help people. That was a little overdone, quite frankly, but it certainly earned it during the Ethiopian crisis. You know, we really took lead in the United Nations and in international bodies with David MacDonald and a whole slew of big-name Canadians. We were the most prominent country there. And we got awakened to the need in the world. This government we have now has just cut our aid budget by $2.7 billion a year. It has responded to the fact that the Americans are cutting virtually their entire world aid budget, and the French and the British and the Germans are also making major cuts to their aid budget. So Canada jumps in and cuts it. Instead of trying to pick up some of the slack, we've been now, having promised in the election campaign that we wouldn't cut aid, we now are going to cut it over the next 4 years by $2.7 billion, which works out to about $700 million a year that we're just whipping out from under the poorest and most desperate people on earth. And I think that kind of is a sobering thought, to say the least. In a world where there are 750 million people, think of that figure, 750 million people who are in extreme malnutrition, food emergency at this time, when 34 million children are virtually on the edge of starvation, and 135 million are thought to be having their whole futures blighted and smaller growth physically and mentally as well. These are devastating statistics we're now facing this world, and almost without much comment or complaint, we're turning away from it. So I leave it. If you can imagine what Canada was like in those days, keep that memory alive, because it may be a glowing period for a very long time, and I give the praise to the Canadians there.
There is so much to talk about, Brian. I want to turn to journalism a little bit more today, the modern state and somewhat depressing state of journalism. You do speak of the great need to have journalists on the ground, to quote the title of your book, as witnesses to history, but that's been greatly diminished. Is that just an evolution of the news business? Why do you think this has happened, and what harm does it cause to the people who have faith in journalists?
Why the diminishment of foreign coverage?
Yes, absolutely.
It is a scourge. I cannot underscore it enough. I mean, an absolute scourge happening to the profession, and it's nowhere is it happening more grisly than here in Canada. I think what is happening is in the 1980s, go back to 1982, Mark Starwitz and a few other leaders of the CBC managed to persuade our management at CBC that Canada should own the podium in news. Remember that sports expression? We're going to go out there and make sure we're not just a bronze medal nation, but we're leading. We're up there in the top of world networks. The national news, together out there, doing amazing work. We read about today, we can hardly imagine days when we had 14 crews at once out around the world, more than a dozen reporters out covering major events. All of that was a golden age of CBC journalism. I don't mean this in any self-congratulatory sense, believe me. I'm not saying I belong in a golden age. I don't. I happen to be in a golden age because that's what journal management was doing in those days. To that, let us compare ourselves to today, when in Canada, the two major private networks were tens of billions of dollars of market capital, have between them, combining their numbers, 2 foreign correspondents covering the world. 2, one in London, a local hire, and one in Washington, who doesn't actually get to travel much because after all is Washington. And it's the CBC hanging on by its fingernails, virtually, fingertips, trying to keep the Canadian broadcast tradition alive, even though it has cut back, I think shamefully in recent years, over the years, to it's now got we're now in a position where you could put all the Canadian broadcast journalists out in the world, in one minivan. and that wouldn't have anybody in the southern hemisphere of the world, because I don't think there is right
There
now.
isn't.
There isn't a single Canadian broadcast journalist anywhere in the bottom half of the entire world. That's what Canadian journalism has sunk to right now. And without the CBC, national broadcaster, you wouldn't have even what we have, which is a corporal's guard bravely doing their best to be the eyes and ears for Canada, but woefully underfinanced and woefully underprotected. And we're doing this at a time when Canada, I think, is in danger of becoming a myopic nation. We're going from Samaritan state to myopic nation. For a country that has no real independent intelligence network working abroad. We have a diplomatic corps that's been sliced down, sliced and diced to a shadow of its former self. We have a cabinet that often seems surprisingly out to lunch about major trade matters around the world and what's happening around the world. And we have Canadian journalism, which is management of the privates don't want to be involved in being eyes and ears abroad. They're happy to take in foreign product. And CBC that's still trying to get off the canvas, to get back out there, which I'm hopeful they will do, by the way.
There were incredible cutbacks in television journalism.
Oh my God. You just know.
I was part of that, sorry.
I mean, yeah, we're talking to a great journalist of our era, really. I'm not just being flattering here, but to not have you out there is just.
Oh, thank you, Brian.
I'll shut up.
They are a reality now, and we have to live in that world, I guess, unless something changes. A lot of journalism, foreign coverage now, is remotely covered, what we call remote journalism. What does that mean for the viewer? What does that mean for the Canadians who are sitting back in their living rooms and want to know at the end of the day what happened in Berlin, what happened in Afghanistan?
Well, somebody will get footage off a German network, perhaps, or some footage, or freelancer, perhaps. It'll be sent back to Canada, and somebody will do a news story of maybe 2 minutes length with a stand-up delivered in maybe Montreal or Toronto or
Yep.
Ottawa. You all see it.
We're seeing it today.
I mean, the thing is, we're not going to get back to the golden age standards, but we can do a lot. A tremendous future could be out there when we start experimenting with ways that, suitcase bureaus, which we both seen can actually work, where you can have rotating teams that go out there and for serious lengths of time. I'm not talking 4 days, but 4 months, 6 months perhaps. I was in a suitcase bureau in Beirut in the height of the civil war there. For I think it was 4.5 months under Anne Medina, famous Canadian woman correspondent. These are things that we can start doing. We can start going into alliances. CBC should be in an alliance with the Star or the Globe, or getting ourselves more out there in alliances, but above all, getting ourselves abroad. And when we can't get abroad, there's a lot you can do here. You can have a dedicated desk devoted to foreign news coverage, and that's all it does. And the people on that desk really know their foreign news coverage. They're experienced, and they're aware of what's going on, not just in the 3 or 4 hotspots that we choose to cover because maybe we can get a reporter there to visit, but going on around the world at any given time. Because one of the great myopic things about our country right now, giant catastrophes, the size of Ethiopia in 1984, are happening among us all the time, and we don't even cover them now. We all know, and without raising that subject here, we've been dedicated to 2 giant conflicts in the world in the last 2, 3, 4 years. Ukraine and the Middle East, obviously. In that same time, a major civil war took place again in Ethiopia, northern Ethiopia, where the death toll is believed to have been between 200,000 and 600,000 dead. And that's more than Gaza and Ukraine combined, and it hardly got any news coverage whatsoever in this country. Absolutely shocking. What's going on in Sudan right now is being carried, both of us have had experience in this, but has been carried basically by foreign networks sending back items, or us begging footage off aid groups or things like that and trying to put a piece together. But, there are two giant famines right now in the world. Gaza, which I think is a famine, and Sudan. Sudan hardly gets any coverage. Ethiopia got no coverage, basically. And that's just leaving out 61 estimated conflicts in the world right now. When I graduated from, I'm going off base.
It's okay. I'm going to bring you back around.
Okay,
We're going to get to some questions.
You get to go old, you get a little bit
I think people really want to ask some questions, but I want to give you a last shot. You've got a minute to tell us, to be a bit of a mentor here, to tell journalists who are looking forward to their careers in the world. What would you tell them about the state of our calling today?
I'm going to tell them something hopeful, because I don't want to really, hopeful with a writer. I think things are in a very, very, very difficult state for journalists today, and I'm not going to gild that lily, for instance. You're having to deal with challenges that I didn't have to deal with, technical challenges, the like of which, I face nothing like that. You have more fragmented world. We live in a vortex of 24/7 news, of crises going on one after another, crises a day. News coverage is fragmented. Conspiracy theories are pouring into this vortex. Networks are splitting up and going under and reforming, and all of these things are very dangerous right now. But the craft of journalism, you've never been more needed in a way. People who really can look at such a complex world and boil things down to be our eyes and ears in the world, to play that very, very important role of journalists. We need journalists more than ever now, more than even in my time. And it's just going to be harder to work in there. But you have skills that I never had. I mean, you're technically so incredibly skilled. I mean, I'm just in awe of you. I mean, you have access to information that I never had. I had to go over to a library and go through old newspaper clippings to find out. I went into Ethiopia with a file this thick of briefing papers that I didn't have a laptop. I didn't have, I worked with a phone, all that kind of stuff. You have these things on your side. You have great spirit on your side, I think.
Thank you, Brian. The mic is open. Don't everybody talk at once. Who wants to ask a question first, second, third? Do you want to be the moderator on this one?
Yeah, I will moderate. We have a few minutes for questions, and so I will, as I'd like to do in these environments, privilege some students to ask some questions first, and then also invite the audience more generally. And even if we only have a few minutes for questions in a formal way, Brian will be here to sign some books at the end, and both Paul and Brian will be here for a little while afterwards. And I would encourage this to be the same sort of thing that you would find in any kind of environment. There is a mystification of journalism that is important and valuable because there is a bit of a distance, but that distance is not what we have today. This is an opportunity that's a really fantastic opportunity. And I'd like to, before everybody has to start shuffling around, and particularly the students who have to go to another engagement next, I'd like to thank both of our speakers today, Paul for excellent and extraordinary questions, and Brian for a generosity of experiences that has really helped us understand the world in a very different kind of way. So thank you both for that.
Thank you.
I'd encourage, if anybody has any questions, you raise your hand. We'll try to get to 2 or 3 of them. I can bring a microphone, but there's a microphone there. And if you want to stand at the mic for the next one, you're welcome to. This is Sean. Sean's a second-year student.
Hi, Sean.
My phone. I took some notes. So kind of going off that last comment you made about the future, I'd like to ask you a technological question. In the course of your careers, there's been breakthrough technologies that have revolutionized the world. And now in 2025, we are again witnessing a cusp of specifically the intersection of AI, greater wealth of open source internet content, and greater computing power. A lot of us from Ravi's class will be graduating in 2028. So my question would be, if you were graduating in 2028, what skills would you prioritize, and what tools would you want to learn how to use?
Paul, why don't you take that?
Oh, thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm a bit of a Luddite because I'm old and I haven't studied and seen the changes in technology or used the changes in technology the way you have. I think I would have to become much more fleet-footed. I would have to learn much more quickly. I would want to be able to master all of the social media in a much greater way. TikTok. I had a little bit of experience with TikTok, and it wasn't terribly fun, I have to say, and it didn't enhance, I don't think it was enhanced reporting of some of the places I was in. But I guess that's the direction we have to go, and me as an older journalist, I would have to learn all of that again and learn the new skills and adapt my journalism to it. I think it's pretty daunting, quite frankly, and I wish you a hell of a lot of luck in moving forward.
I would say I would agree with all of that. I have less technology in my mind than Paul. But I would say something else. I would say, yes, you got all that stuff, and you really have to work hard to get it because it's so valuable to it. But keep the basics solidly in mind. What really strikes me with reading a lot of the high-tech new journalists is some of them are really damn good journalists. I mean, their writing is excellent. It would have shown up really well back in 1962. My God, it would have won awards back in 1955. I mean, that basic craft of being able to tell a story that needs to be told with the right degree of color, the right degree of precision, sometimes the lyrical magic to the story. All of that is still being performed by people who are working in all this, with all this technological gear that I can hardly express. So keep in mind, you want to become a damn good craftsman and a bit of an artist at the same time. Journalism is a time you can really love that act of describing what you see and telling people about it. And it's there and at your core.
So we have a question here from Lauren, who is also a second-year student.
Okay, this one works, okay. I hope this isn't redundant. I do space out sometimes. But, you know, being a journalist, you know how you have so much control over an entire world, how it's portrayed, how you present it, what you show. Do you find that you would really grapple with, like, what details you chose to put in, like, stories, how you chose to frame certain things? I mean, when it comes to something like video, that can even just come down to, like, what footage you show. But I guess, how did you kind of grapple with that, like, huge responsibility of, I guess, portrayal?
Well, a deadline helps you grapple with it. You know, I always found a deadline was a big helper to me because you can get lost in the weeds a lot on stories. That was one big help. The knowledge that you have to come up, in the end, you have to do your story. You have to do it on time. You've been trained how to do it. You know you're going to be able to do it. Get confident and do it. But another thing works too, and that is certainly in television broadcast. You work as a team. I mean, you've got people you can ask advice of. You've got editors who will give you wonderful ideas. You've got producers who are giving you all the time their feed, in camera people. So, I mean, you're not necessarily working alone there. But in the end, it is a heavy responsibility. But I think like life generally, you just go up the patterns. You get used to more and more responsibility. My first round of stories was with the Oshawa Times, covering flower shows and the local education budget, you know, stuff like that. I finally got confident enough with Oshawa Times, then I moved up to the Montreal Gazette. You build the confidence as you go.
I think you have to be an effective storyteller, and the more important question, I think, is what do you leave out? And you have to know what you're not going to put into whatever television story or written news report. It's a little easier because you have more space and more time. But I think that's the key ingredient with television, what you leave out. Find the most salient points, get them down quickly, and put it on the air.
So we have one more question from Miriam, who's a student. If anybody else has a question, we maybe have time for one or two before, after Miriam.
Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. I have two questions. First question, when you were assigned to cover the famine in Ethiopia, were you familiar with the country, like neighboring countries, like the neighboring regions with Ethiopia?
Was I when I went in there?
No, before you were
No,
assigned.
no, I was not. I had, in fact, where I was in Lebanon covering civil war there.
Okay.
And then I was covering a papal visit to Canada. That's the thing of being a foreign correspondent. You're going to end up going to an awful lot of places that you've never thought of being before.
All right. Okay, my second question. So when you said later you returned back to cover the governmental issues that were happening there. So why do you think like Western or Canadian media showed little interest in covering what was happening in Eritrea, which is next door to Ethiopia at the time, despite its own struggle with war, hunger, and oppression, and they were also colonized by Ethiopia at that time?
The last conflict you
They were Eritrea at the time were colonized by Ethiopia.
Right.
During the time of hunger, like the 80s.
Yeah, we covered that there was a civil war going on when we were covering the famine, the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation, and there was also the Eritrean Liberation Front. If you're talking about that area, yes, we not only had a famine, but we had a war in the mountains, which we saw very little of, but we were always threatened by it to some degree. Yeah, but we actually probably gave a lot more coverage of the continent back then than has been given nowadays. I don't, that's throwaway, sorry.
I have a question. In terms of being a foreign correspondent, when it comes to the language barrier in certain countries, how is that like a challenge versus like what you can do as an outsider versus like local reporters who can speak the language fluently?
Well, you're going to be going to an awful lot of countries that you don't speak the language of, and you couldn't unless you're going to be one of these amazing people who can do 35 languages. So being in a country where you don't speak the language is just part of it. But you work with, certainly in my case, and I'm talking about television, you work with a local fixer, obviously. And you work with, obviously, on top of that, a translator as well. So you're continually surrounded by translation as it goes. You're never really left out there without translation devices and what have you. But if you have the trouble is if you become fluent in, Tigrinya, for instance, the language of Tigrinya, you're not going to be working anywhere else but Tigrinya. I mean, that's a problem where you find yourself at ease. I tried to learn Tigrinya, and I failed to do it.
We have one further question.
Thank you again, Brian and Paul. I'm just wondering, this is more for both of you. What kind of supports would you recommend? Because Brian spoke earlier about, PTSD and moral influence, and I'm just wondering, what kind of supports do you think would be good coming back from, I guess, foreign countries?
I'll pick up just quickly. I think and Brian made the point that the networks are much better and the news organizations are much better today at recognizing the problems and the issues that journalists face. And they do have programs where you can get help, you can get therapy. And I do know CBC proactively asks their journalists, how are you feeling, how are you doing? Would you like some outside help? Can we deal with you, can we help you in as much as we possibly can? It's much different than it was a number of years ago. This is all done in privacy, of course. It's because it's a very difficult thing for a journalist to admit that he or she has PTSD. It can affect your career and it can affect the way you're going to move going forwards. But they the networks certainly are much better than they were before. I know this from personal involvement with people who have been deeply affected by PTSD. And for a long time, the networks simply had no interest, couldn't deal with it properly, and didn't deal with it properly. And I think they're much better at it now.
Yes, and the journalists were often the ones who were least willing to reform, even more so than the management often. But now they have links in the profession where journalists abroad in a conflict zone can phone a number and he's in touch with somebody, an expert on PTSD. And he could be in his hotel room saying, look, I'm having these symptoms. And they're actually having a sort of session right then, which is, I think, incredibly valuable.
Well, I really do appreciate this entire experience. I forgot to acknowledge the School of Journalism puts on a lot of events across the year, and all of the different events are generally public-facing because this is important for it to be both live and in the community and with people, but also in front of students and having students involved in this conversation. As members of our extended journalism family, it's very, very valuable for students today to be able to look at the multiple experiences of journalism across decades. Our colleague Jean Allen was instrumental, along with Lisa Ray, who is Brian's agent at Simon and Schuster, and Jacqueline Mika to help organize this event. And I have to say, when we host events, there's lots of different formats, but this was probably the most perfect format, a conversation between two extraordinary graduates, but who are speaking about a world that we're being led into in a really intimate way that I appreciate so fully. And I thank you both for generously offering your time and for being here in this community. And I'd like to thank everybody who is here for coming, and I'd like to encourage you to come back to other events that we have, because we have events all year long, different speakers, lots of different topics, and lots of different exposures to the world.
Could I just make one PS? Because a lot of it was grim chatter about grim things, I don't want to leave the impression that it's all dire out there. I mean, frankly, Paul will back me up on this, we had fabulous times as well as foreign correspondents. I probably covered as many, if not more, peace treaties than wars. I mean, so you do see the great side of human beings as well.
So get out there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both.
Thank you.